It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Damian Howard to give our seminar. Damian teaches theology at Haythrop College in London. He has studied widely, according to his CV, in theology and philosophy and Islamic studies. And he combines his teaching with being a Jesuit priest and also with a lot of speaking and broadcasting more widely in this area. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Damian, and we look forward to what you have to say about evolution and Islam. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Hilary, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today. It's a great pleasure, actually, just to be back in Cambridge, and especially at St Edmund's College, which is very much a place I associate with a big spiritual step forward in my own life, which is to say my call to become a Jesuit. Perhaps some of you are long enough in the tooth to remember the late Dr. Chris Moss, erstwhile dean of this college, and the first Jesuit I ever encountered. His passion for theology and astronomy quite simply took my breath away, and are at least partly responsible for the way that my life has panned out. So I'd like, for what it's worth, to dedicate my talk today to his memory. It's horrible to think that I arrived down the road at Trinity College exactly 30 years ago, where I ended up studying theology under John Bowker. It was scholars working at the divinity faculty in those days who had inspired and stimulated my own religious thinking, people like Nicholas Lash, John Polkinghorne, Warner Hooker, Chris Rowlands and Don Cupid. In terms of interreligious relations, the faculty's interests in those days were more focused on the Indian religions than on Islam, thanks to the presence of Julius Lipner. If my own interest in the dialogue between religion and science started there, I'm afraid I can't say that it flowered into any great conclusive insights on the subject, and nor has it done till this day. But it was helpful, I think, as a preparation which enabled me much later as a doctoral student to realise that evolutionary ideas from Europe, ideas and ideology of the 19th and 20th centuries, had had a profound impact on contemporary Islamic thought. Indeed, one which needs to be understood if the broad array of contemporary Islamic identities available in current Europe today is to be understood. The book which came out of this research, Being Human in Islam, The Impact of the Evolutionary Worldview, helpfully on sale in the vestibule out there, remains the #1 item on Google Books if you type in Islam and evolutionary theory. And I think that tells you something about the state of interest and engagement on this topic. Not very much. My principal interest when I started doctoral studies in Birmingham in 2005 was Islamic anthropology. My knowledge of the Islamic tradition at that stage was very basic indeed, but a colleague had suggested to me that anthropology was a neuralgic issue in dialogue between Christians and Muslims, because the overbearing nature of Islamic monotheism, he said, was such as to exclude the possibility of acknowledging real human dignity, as Catholic Christianity was able to do. I wasn't entirely convinced of that line at this stage. Nevertheless, I took the bait and embarked on a bit of reading. What transpired was that acceptance or rejection of one or other sorts of evolutionary ideas had often been axiomatic in the generation of a particular school of thought in contemporary Islam. And that surprised me immensely, because the impression one has is that evolutionary theory simply rolls off Islamic thought like water off a duck's back. Well, not so, it turns out. Perhaps I should say something briefly about what made me open to this possibility, because it touches on my methodology and will immediately alert you to something about the way I've come at all this, which makes my approach, I think, a little bit different to the usual ways in which science and religion are brought into conversation. I take it that the evolutionary way of thinking to be I take evolutionary way of thinking to be not just true, as it were, though I'm happy to do that. It's also profoundly resonant with the social imaginary of the extended romantic period of culture through which we have been living for several centuries already, and which shows little signs of fading away. I've been profoundly influenced by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor and his analysis of the journey European cultures have been on over the last 500 years or so, as they've embraced a uniquely immanentist take on the world around them. Taylor's account of the slow evolution of what he calls the immanent frame, this social imaginary which we have, which has such difficulty with transcendence, and which today we all inhabit, believer and non-believer alike, starts way back in the High Middle Ages with the medieval Catholic Church's vigorous pastoral programme of encouraging all the faithful to live up to the highest standards of authentic Christian discipline. It then follows, he says, the trajectory of the social imaginary as it passes through the Reformation, Enlightenment deism, and then on into the sunny uplands of what he terms the imminent counter-enlightenment, before it shatters into many splinters in the vast diversity we begin to see in the early 20th century. Well, I shan't go into any more details on this, not least because many of you will be familiar with Charles Taylor's ideas. It suffices to say, for my purposes today, that evolution as a trope fits very comfortably indeed into this immanentist take on reality, which is why we find it being touted already by Goethe in the 18th century. Evolution allows us to avoid appeal to inconvenient, transcendent categories, such as the great chain of being or divine causation. It can be made to tell a story of the world's becoming and human becoming through matter's own powers of self-generation. It's a truism to avert to the materialism inherent in some versions of evolutionary thought, but this is not true of all evolutionary theories. Some also warrant a re-enchantment of sorts, in that the evolutionary idea can serve to connect human beings to the rest of the world. Again, after Descartes has left us stranded observers cut off from extended reality. I think that's why it's so easy for evolution to become a locus of conflict with religion and religions, because, as Mary Midgley has pointed out, suitably interpreted, evolution can readily take on a quasi-religious aspect itself, conducing to a condition of wonder and an excess of meaning which other scientific theories don't seem able to manage. If I were to say that the evolutionary worldview provided the creation myth of the modern West, I would be liable to be misunderstood. But I do think that the gravitational force it manifestly exerts on the imaginations of modern Westerners, rather more palpable than their endorsement of, say, quantum theory or general relativity, is in part explicable in terms of the constant need we have as human beings to ask and answer questions of identity. Where do we come from? Who? What are we? What is our destiny? And evolutionary theories have yielded apparently attractive, indeed compelling answers to those questions, and continue to do so. It's easy to assume that there is massive resistance among Muslims to the theory of evolution. Certainly there's plenty of anecdotal evidence in that direction. There's a flourishing Turkish creationist presence on the web. The notorious Harun Yahya is still publishing immense amounts of material on the subject, and research has indicated a strong link between Turkish and North American and anti-evolutionary fundamentalism. In this country, it's only a few years ago that Dr. Osama Hassan, an East London imam and physics lecturer, currently working for the anti-radicalization think tank, the Quilliam Foundation, received death threats after stating publicly his acceptance of evolutionary science, and eventually felt compelled to retract his comments. In my experience, most ordinary Muslims seem to assume that evolution cannot be true because it is simply incompatible with Islam, and they're very surprised to hear that Catholics, among others, have no particular objection to it, assuming that Christians tend to be anti-science anyway. On the other hand, statistics from the Pew Research Center show Muslim acceptance of evolution in the United States as being lower than among Catholics and secularists, but substantially higher than among evangelicals. I'm told that among younger people in Turkey today, there's now a move towards accepting evolutionary ideas. And I was surprised to witness myself at a large gathering of young European Muslims in Brussels about a year ago. On a straw poll, about 60% professed to accept the truth of evolution, seeing it as in no way incompatible with their religious beliefs. However the figures pan out, two things are clear. First, very little intellectual work has been done in the modern period by mainstream Muslims on how evolutionary theory might be appropriated by Islamic thought. There are several reasons for this, some of which I will refer to as we go along. Second, relatively few people are aware of the fact that Muslims have been wrestling with this issue for quite some time now, and that evolutionary ideas have certainly impacted on a number of highly influential schools of religious thought in the 20th century. It seems to me that if one were minded to attend to the first matter, it would be helpful to be mindful of the second. Some hope. Let me add one other quick remark before I come to the 4 cases which I look at in my book, and which I just want to summarise for you this afternoon. One does come across from time to time the case of a Muslim who's not only happy to deem evolution compatible with Islam, but insists that it is an idea first proposed by Muslims. It strikes me as a classic case of epistemological triumphalism, and I have yet to find a truly convincing example. For the most part, those examples put forward are tendentious cases from Ibn Khaldun and others, in which the actual ideas being propounded are far removed from anything we would call biological evolution today. And apart from anything else, as is almost universally acknowledged, the idea of evolution was actually invented by a Jesuit. Let me look then at 4 different phases, different modalities by which Islam and evolution have come up into some kind of dialogue and encounter. The first is the 19th century engagement. The first encounter between evolutionary ideas and Muslims took place in the Arab world in the latter decades of the 19th century. I think the following factors are important for understanding how, in spite of the efforts of a small number of Muslims to engage positively with the new science, the encounter actually laid the foundations for a long-term hostility among Muslims towards evolutionary ideas. So the first factor, I think, is that the evolutionary theory which arrived in Arabic-speaking countries was not that of Darwin. Don't forget, the origin was not fully translated into Arabic until as late as 1964. Rather, it came under the form of the much more ideological ideas of Buchner and Spencer. It was, in other words, strongly linked from the outset to the ideas of progress and hard-going materialism. Now, it's not been unusual even for Darwin to be associated at a popular level with the ideas of inevitable progress and reductionistic secularism. But at least one can challenge such interpretations with good reason. Social Darwinists, however, really did believe in these things, and Arab Muslims were acutely aware that the evolutionary motif came loaded with that agenda. That made things very difficult. I think the second factor flows from that. The idea of progress was quickly associated in Arab minds with the thought that European society regarded itself as the highest point of evolution so far. Muslim self-esteem had already been wounded by the superiority complex of their European colonial masters in places like Egypt, and assenting to the evolutionary idea seemed to mean capitulating to Western arrogance, assuming that evolution had indeed reached a peak in modern Europe. Third factor, the threat of materialism is very easy to understand. It's anti-religious and therefore incompatible with Islam. But it had an added edge in the Arab world. Materialism, rather like nationalism, was to be exploited by Arab Christians in the region, notably in Lebanon, as a way of sidelining the place of Islam in the political and cultural domain. It was a Catholic Arab, Shibli Shumail, who you see in the middle there. That's Spencer on the far left, just in case you were wondering who he was. He was Shibli Shumail, who translated Buchner's commentary on Darwin into Arabic, and who was to be the best-known Arab advocate of evolutionary ideas. But there were other Christians, too, involved in that debate. People called Salama Musa and the Orthodox Faris Nimr, who in various ways broadcast the new ideas and established a strong link in Muslim minds between evolutionary doctrine and a Christianity which was not friendly to Muslim hegemony. A fourth factor, it's worth mentioning as a further feature of this encounter, that the neuralgic issue in Muslim minds at this stage was less the thorny issue of human origins than the nature of the human embryo. No doubt this has something to do with the Quranic depiction of the development of the human being from a fertilized egg, or at least that's how Muslims often interpret it today. This is made abundantly clear, for instance, in the famous diatribe of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who's the third character on the right there, against allegedly Darwinian theory, when he inveighs against the Western materialists thus, and I quote him, "One group of materialists decided that the germs of all species, especially animals, are identical, that there's no difference between them, and that the species also have no essential distinction. Therefore, they said, these germs transform from one species to another and change from one form to another through the demands of time and place, according to need, and moved by external forces." It's possible that al-Afghani has in mind the work of Ernst Haeckel here. It's a bit garbled, but it's just possible. It's used in any case to good effect to make the theory of evolution sound ludicrous and to link it to events taking place in the lifespan of an individual rather than over the course of millions of years. So I think that factor makes things just a little bit more complicated in terms of communicating what Western ideas about evolution actually are. And a final factor, which I don't think one can avoid thinking about, the whole debate, insofar as a debate was had, took place within the context of a colonial situation in which the distorting effects of an unbalanced power relationship were inescapable. We all know that the evolutionary idea has played havoc in parts of the Christian world, but at least they weren't part of a package of foreign impositions, experienced as humiliating and degrading. In the Muslim world, it was almost impossible to ask questions about evolutionary science and philosophy without it being refracted unhelpfully through the colonial lens. For all the complications these 5 obstacles presented, it's striking that a debate of sorts was nevertheless had. The first exemplar is Hussein al-Jisr al-Tarabalusi, 1845 to 1909, a Lebanese scholar who set out to accommodate evolutionary theory in a famous and influential text, Al-Risala al-Hamidiyya, in 1887. A response to Shibli Shumail, the book aims to defend the doctrine of Tawhid, that strict Muslim monotheism, which is the very core doctrine of the Quran, to defend the doctrine of Tawhid from materialist onslaught and to bring materialists to Islam. Far from being necessarily materialistic, evolutionary theory can, he believes, furnish evidence of divine design. Al-Jisr attaches great importance to the provisional, unproven status of the theory, but he also suggests that the application of reason should affect the way the Quran is read, so that were science to prove a given text untrue, it would need to be interpreted figuratively. In itself, the sacred text neither indicates man's instant or gradual developmental formation. This kind of compatibilism, if I can call it that, would prove to be a popular reformist tack among Muslim writers. A mid-20th century version is found in the work of an Iraqi Shia writer, Abu al-Majid Muhammad Rida al-Isfahani, whose work represents a milestone in the dissemination of evolutionary theory to the Shia community. He contests Buchner and Shumail, arguing that the human mind radically distinguishes humans from animals, and speculating that, quote, nothing could prevent the monkey from catching up with humans if he possessed a mind and the ability to speak as man, end of quote. And he finds in the Brethren of Purity and the Kitab al-Tawhid, the book of monotheism of the 6th Shi'i Imam, the idea of anatomical commonality between human and animal, which accorded, he says, with the theory of biological evolution. So that's the first and, if you like, foundational moment of encounter, but it doesn't set the agenda for everyone. A second modality of the encounter is what I'm calling Bergsonian optimism, Bergsonian Islam, and it's a mode in which evolutionary ideas were to enter the world of Islam through the philosophical influence of Henri Bergson, a great French philosopher of the first part of the 20th century. Again, we're not dealing with Darwin, but with a great French Jewish philosopher of vitalism and personalism, who was so prominent a figure during the long years of Darwin's eclipse, before genetic science came on the scene and changed the picture quite drastically. Bergson's philosophical project, let us remind ourselves, consisted in nothing less than re-establishing the place of spirit in a world in which stifling immanentism and materialism had become almost irresistible. To follow Bergson meant being both scientific and spiritual. His metaphysics were a serious attempt to rethink philosophy from the very roots up, in an evolutionary age, asking what ultimate reality must be like if the world is not yet complete, as it were, but in a state of perpetual becoming. So it's a radical approach to take to the science-religion debate. It's no wonder, all things considered, that Bergson was of enormous importance in the Catholic world, enabling a golden generation of intellectuals, I'm talking of Maritain and Peggy, among others, to rediscover their religious patrimony, and then, having done so, to leave him behind, sometimes with scorn. The most important Catholic reader of Bergson was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, whose scientific interest in evolution and whose mystical approach both derive from Bergson's own concerns. Teilhard's ideas today are not so much an intellectual point of reference for theologians on the whole. Rather, they seem to have a certain symbolic value. Catholics are delighted and relieved, for the most part, that a serious religious thinker had been able to reconcile evolution with the Christian message, and tend to think, with that, the job is done. They don't need to worry too much now about any great clash between their faith and science in general. I think something similar could be said about Bergsonian Islam too. The key figure, of course, is a Cambridge alumnus and fellow Trinity man of mine, in fact, Muhammad Iqbal, winking at us there in the middle. Muhammad Iqbal is a giant of modern Islamic thought. A poet, mystic, and philosopher, he was also the founding genius of the idea of Pakistan, and is revered as its spiritual father to this day. His shrine in Lahore is still the object of great devotion and pilgrimage in that country. His most significant intellectual achievement are the 6 lectures written to reconstruct religious thought in Islam. The central plank of his project was the recovery of a sense of Islam as a dynamic religion, forging a future, helping the flourishing of robust human individuals, a very modern sort of Islam he had in mind. That required a very new sort of metaphysics to replace the traditional Kalam, the traditional theology of Islam, which he and so many other Muslim reformers blamed for turning Islam into a religion of fatalism and conservatism. This is where Bergson's evolutionary ethos comes in. For Bergson, the cosmos is a place of creative evolution, constant flux and process, infused by the dynamism of the élan vital. The human capacity for intuition is capable of perceiving this truth, enabling the human agent to participate in the process of creative evolution in a uniquely intimate way. Iqbal's attachment to the idea of evolution, which he believes came from the Islamic world in the first place, and was ultimately inspired by the Quran itself, is above all due to his desire to advance a certain vision of the human being. He thinks of the cosmos as existing to generate immortal egos. And the whole of history, the history of life, represents a movement of perpetual development in that very direction. Quoting from a passage by the Sufi poet Rumi, he sees the human as having been drawn through each level of being, inorganic, then plant, animal, and then human. This is the quotation. Thus, man passed from one order of nature to another, till he became wise and knowing and strong as he is now. Of his first souls he has now no remembrance, and he will be again changed from his present soul. Ultimately, Iqbal traces this trajectory in order to suggest that the ultimate human destiny was to come through death itself. He would build up such a powerful ego by the spiritual path of Islam that when death came along, you were so robust, you just hurtled through the barrier into something beyond it. It's very macho kind of Islam. Iqbal's use of an evolutionary paradigm clearly has nothing in common with Darwinian theory. It's at the service of a drastic recasting of the mystical vision of the classical Islamic tradition. As he states, this is a quotation, "The theory of evolution has brought despair and anxiety instead of hope and enthusiasm for life to the modern world. The reason is to be found in the unwarranted modern assumption that man's present structure, mental as well as physiological, is the last word in biological evolution, and that death, regarded as a biological event, has no constructive meaning. The world of today needs a Rumi to create an attitude of hope and to kindle the fire of enthusiasm for life." I don't want to over-egg this, but I talk in my book about Bergsonian Islam, and I have in mind a rather disparate and small group of figures who've all been influenced in one way or another by the French philosopher. Two others who I think are worth mentioning are the Moroccan intellectual Mohamed Aziz Lahbabi, working in the 1950s, and a Senegalese philosopher, Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who's still alive and I think fairly young today, certainly active. Lahbabi worked under the influence of French Catholic personalism in the 1940s and 50s to produce his own version, his own Muslim personalism. Not ultimately a very influential figure, Lahbabi saw personalism as offering a third way, avoiding the pitfalls of existentialism on the one hand and Marxism on the other, and providing Muslims with a robust philosophical framework within which to articulate a fairly aggressive stance with regard to colonial Europe. Souleymane Bachir Diagne, still alive as I've said, has written rather less profusely, but is enchanted by the prospect of the transhuman. You could almost sense that in Iqbal too. And he uses Bergson and Iqbal to reimagine Islam as a dynamic movement in human history. Islam for Diagne is quite simply a spirit of perpetual openness, creativity and reformation. The use of that latter term, with all its associations in European religious history, is totally deliberate. And for Diagne, it's a revelatory component of Iqbal's vision and project. The key to such reform in the legal domain is applying a hermeneutic to Islamic sources, which focuses on understanding the movement rather than the actual content outlined by the letter of revelation. So the original movement of Islamic revelation was, for instance, towards the full equality of men and women. And it's this movement which should be honoured today, according to Diagne, rather than the precise legal prescription of the scholastic tradition, which perpetuates a letter which isn't always egalitarian. Well, modernity turns out to be an accessory to this project of fidelity to the original movement. To quote Diagne, liberating the mind from all the weight accumulated over centuries of a strictly literal reading whose dominant principle was conformism. So that's Bergsonian Islam. The third modality, which I'm going to spend a little bit less time on, because it's in some ways less complicated. That's not quite true. As I say that, I think that is not true, but I will say a little bit less about it. Is what I call, or what is called perennialism or Islamic traditionalism. Lest we lose sight of the impact of mere biological theories of evolution, which you'll be wondering why I haven't been talking about them so far, let's turn to this third classification I have in mind, the group of esoteric Muslims, and indeed others. This is an open school to Christians and Hindus and others, who together make up the perennialist or traditionalist school, represented most notably in the Muslim world by a scholar of immense learning and distinction. You may well have heard of Sayyid Hossein Nasr. Professor Nasr is a passionate opponent of the theory of evolution, but his position could hardly be called creationist. His is perhaps the most philosophically rigorous and radical argument against evolutionary theory there is, or could possibly be. Nasr, he's there on the far right in this case, is an American-Iranian Sufi who's also written a great deal about the age of Islamic philosophy, particularly that of the classical period. His thought is very much in the line of Islamic Neoplatonism, but he's also the latest in a string of esoteric practitioners who combine their strict Islamic metaphysics with an analysis of modernity which could not be more pessimistic. The theory of evolution is taken by these thinkers to be a symptom of the utter intellectual depravity to which the modern era has sunk. and in that sense is to be rejected in no matter what guise it is to be found. It's quite helpful to trace Nasser's intellectual genealogy apart from the one I've just done, apart from through Islamic, from Sufism and philosophy. It starts with the writings of the occultist, apocalypticist turned Muslim René Guénon on the far left there. This Jesuit-educated Frenchman quickly dispensed with the overly sentimental Catholicism of his upbringing, and despairing of the state of the modern world in the aftermath of the First World War, headed off in the pursuit of hidden truth, ancient wisdom, and esoteric initiation. This he eventually found in Sufism in French North Africa. His Sufism no doubt tempered his apocalyptic despair, but inspired him to develop an understanding of the relationship between revelation and the sacred tradition to which it gave rise. His thought was further developed by the Swiss convert to Islam, Fritjof Schuon, who's in the middle there. A slightly intimidating figure to have staring at you, as he is. Schuon mitigated the anti-Christian animus of Guénon's pen and broadened the horizon of inquiry of the school. Both writers, along with their perennialist associates from the Hindu, Christian, and other traditions, retained a conviction that the cosmos had by this stage entered what they call the Kali Yuga, the final age of the cosmic cycle. It's a Hindu idea, during which human beings are at their farthest removed from divine truth and revelation, and during which, therefore, the forces of divine order collapse. Nasser's thought fits neatly into the same template. All previous civilizations, he says, have been based on sacred revelation, which have generated in their turn sacred traditions, including sacred arts and sacred sciences. It's only the modern Western world, successor to the traditional world of medieval Christianity, which grounds itself in an arid rationalism and has all but dispensed with the living source of its sacred tradition. This is not merely a sad turn of events, he thinks. Western secular modernity is nothing less than an inversion of the sacred order, a parody of all that is wholesome and divinely inspired. The nadir of this parody is the rejection of the great chain of being and its substitution by evolutionary theory as an account of the relationship of life to the origin of the cosmos. So it's not merely that evolutionary theory conflicts with the Quran here. You can hear there's an awful lot more going on. Nor just that evolutionary is scientifically incoherent, though Nasser also believes that and has argued it, but that it's emblematic of a humanity gone dreadfully wrong. So wrong that it refuses to acknowledge its pontifical vocation in the cosmos, the vocation of being a bridge between this order and the order of eternity. Instead, it has embraced a Promethean anthropology and an immanentism which blinds it to its divine origins. It's amusing, I find, when Nasser is described, as he sometimes is in American Christian circles, as a liberal Muslim. This is hardly a description he must relish, however well-intentioned its use. But precisely because he's philosophically minded, pluralistic in his outlook, and opposed to extremism in all its forms, he's often taken a standing for a mainstream moderate Islam or even a progressive one, while his radical opposition to the modern world, and especially to the theory of evolution, rather gives the lie to that. The fourth phase, the fourth modality I want to mention, the Islamization of the sciences, the Islamization of knowledge. This final classification relates the variety of responses to the project so characteristic of the 1970s and 80s of the Islamization of the sciences. It's true that some would place Nasser's thought under precisely this category, but I think that his rigorous philosophical approach and indeed bleak assessment of the modern world sets him apart. The Islamization project has just a hint of the postmodern to it. It begins with a critique of the Western social and natural sciences and argues that they need to be refounded, removing, as it were, the axioms based on Christian or secular ideas and replacing them with solid Quranic or other Islamic principles. The project took a variety of ideological guises. On the left there you have the Malaysian scholar Syed Muhammad Naqib al-Attas. He had a project to derive founding principles from a very traditional Sufi framework, though not one quite as philosophical as Nasser's. He does share with Nasser a profound distaste for the idea of evolution, which he sees as expressive of the turbulence and the restlessness of Christian theology. On the other hand, there's the rather less intellectual approach of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, the IIIT, under the guidance of the Palestinian intellectual and activist Ismail al-Farouqi. A sad story, he was assassinated, an important figure in this Islamization project. Here the question once again becomes that of the compatibility of sound Quranic principles with the contents of Western science. And so the results are rather unpredictable. It all depends which bits of the Quran you look at and how you interpret them. I could go into more detail here, and some people like to get into this sort of stuff. But the main point to bring out is that the project of Islamization is by now widely felt to have failed, and as far as I'm aware, is not actively pursued, even in places like the IIIT. If one may be allowed to speculate as to the root cause for that, I'd say it's this. The Sufis understand that the theory of evolution is a profound challenge to the way that Muslims have traditionally understood Islam and hence resist it, insisting on their own traditional metaphysics or ideational systems. In this, they're seen to be they're holding on to something secondary to the sources of revelation to themselves and are easily dismissed in an era when the classical Islamic tradition has come under attack and when strong voices are raised to denounce Sufism, or at least to put its principles into question. On the other hand, the more Salafi-minded, such as al-Farouqi, who readily have recourse directly to the Quranic text itself, are intellectually very superficial and treat the question in a simple literalistic fashion, unable to grasp the deeper theological challenges. It's not much fun reading through that literature, and there's not an awful lot of insight, I think, that comes out from it. So just a few words of conclusion and then we'll wrap up. I hope that this rapid survey has shown that there has indeed been some serious attempt on the part of Muslim thinkers to address the question of evolutionary theory and its relationship to Islam. In some respects, the philosophical apparatus which has been applied to that discussion is of the highest sophistication. We're certainly not here talking about crude creationism, though that does figure rather prominently in public perceptions of the debate. I'm not aware of a huge amount of thinking in this area currently taking place, and I fear that this is due to the fact that the intellectual highbrow in the Muslim world is rather conservative and not concerned with such issues, whereas there's rather more popular interest in questions which centre on political and identity matters. It's helpful to remind oneself, however, that the question of evolution and its impact on Christian theology is not absolutely central to our own priorities these days either, though thanks to people like Sarah Coakley, among others, it is there as one of a cocktail of themes which do keep cropping up. And with the science itself changing, it's still very much a work in progress for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damian. Absolutely fascinating lecture and plenty of time for questions. And
that's what I was worried about.
So, do we have questions? Who's got the microphone? Later. Down here, Caroline's got a question.
Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant talk. I learned so much from it. Well, I didn't, because most of it didn't go in, but whatever. Is it possible how do you glue together the really genuine Sufi tradition of not the technicalities, but the principle of the great chain of being, and of man being that bridge between created and creator? How do you keep those two notions together with a modern scientific view of how life marches on? I mean, is it possible?
Gosh, that's a really technical question. I don't regard myself as anyway expert enough to speak about Sufism with the expertise that it sounds like you have.
Well, I'm thinking of a perfectly Christian Orthodox position. Maximus Confessor talks about man being...
Yes, no, I mean, that's
so
right.
It's not just Sufi.
No, you're absolutely right. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I'm sorry. That's not above my pay grade. Do you have another thought, or
Me?
something important for you? You're obviously not persuaded by someone like Iqbal. I mean, he doesn't try to do that. Is anybody trying to do that? Oh, right. Okay. Well, as soon as you kind of do the reduction to values, I mean, as soon as you take the metaphysics out and say, well, you make that pragmatic move. This has a cache of value in terms of stuff that we can all understand in the modern age. But it seems to me that you've given in. No? I mean, you talked about reconciling one sort of metaphysics with another, it seems to me. Once you kind of take the metaphysics out of it and say, well, this boils down to certain values, well, there's no problem anymore, is there?
I suppose I was trying to maintain the...
Do you need the microphone for your thoughts to be picked up? Yeah.
I would want to maintain the rigour of the modern scientific analysis,
Yes.
and its thoroughness and its adherence to the principles of finding out about the creation through our God-given senses,
Yes.
which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do,
Yeah.
and the values of understanding that humans have this specific role in creation, as a bridge between creator and created.
Yes. I haven't been able to pull that one off myself. It is a tricky one because what are you trying to do with two different epistemologies? Is it about reconciliation, or you're going to end up twisting one into the other, it seems to me. Certainly none of the people I've looked at here trying to do that. They stick very much in their metaphysical camp, Iqbal, in sort of rather modern... I mean, he's probably trying to do a little bit of what you're trying to do, but even then...
It sounds so dreadful either-or-ish, doesn't it?
Well, it does,
which
rather.
it is, I mean, but...
It is, yeah.
But
Do you know anybody who's managed to...
So are the parables of the gospel, so...
Oh. I'm sorry, I can't.
Maybe that's something
That's
we...
quite a tall order you're giving me. I hope not all the questions are going to be about
Well,
level of ambition.
Maybe we can come and pool our ignorance or our thoughts in the discussion
Yes.
time afterwards. So,
Sure, it's a longer conversation to have.
yes. Right.
Yes.
Hi there, I have a question about the origin of the phrase, the Mohammedan theory of evolution, which I know that occurs in Draper's book, History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, if I'm not mistaken,
Oh, right, is it? Okay.
from the 1880s.
Yes.
So my question is twofold. One, do you know of other Victorian authors who would have used that phrase? And two, where did they get that?
Wow.
Why would they have referred to 20 plus years after publication of Origin of Species, why would they have referred to that as the Mohammedan theory of evolution?
Gosh, that's totally new to me. That's fascinating. I mean, I'd understood that Iqbal was basically the first person to be making this kind of claim, that others had just sort of improvised on his ideas. But if that's true, that's certainly very interesting. Yeah, gosh, you're showing up my ignorance today. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that. No idea where it comes from. Where could it be? Yeah, sorry. Yes, have you got a thought?
I think Draper made it up. I mean, he made up a lot of stuff, so yeah, but there you go. That's my comment. Sorry.
Thank you, Dennis. There's a question at the back now.
So I'll reveal my own ignorance of social theory instead of revealing ignorance. So one thing I'm just struck by when I was listening to your presentation was just connections with some other concepts that I've sort of been exposed to. So, I mean, one was there was just a discussion yesterday as part of the Cambridge Science Festival about the trying to get the message of climate change out and sort of the resistance by some religious communities to that. And part of it is that some of the science is just overlaid with this, non-scientific, political, social baggage, if you will, that makes it hard for the group to accept sort of the whole package. Just as you were talking about with the reception of evolutionary theory in Islam in the beginning, because of the context and the sense of the people who are hearing about the science feeling somehow at a disadvantage. And I'm thinking too, when you're talking about Islamization of science, the sort of feminism, or what do they call it, feminization or feminism project in science. I don't mean about the representation of women, but just that the construction of science and the language of science and mathematics and so forth has somehow a masculine view, and that needs to be reconceptualized. So I don't know if there is. I was trying to think about just the history of evolutionary theory in the Christian world in the 19th century and some of the opposition that arose in that context. And there I don't think it was so much of power imbalance situation. So I don't know whether you see any common themes on sort of these subjects you've been bringing up about kind of the Muslims, hearing about the scientific theory and kind of trying to come to terms with the social context in which it's being received. Right?
It's a huge topic. I mean, in a sense, this question of the impact of the colonial experience on Islamic thought in general is, if you like, it provides a paradigm for the way in which the discussion is being had in the Western Academy today, and indeed for many, many Muslims about the way they think about Islam. And the whole project of Islamism, it seems to me, is driven by an understanding of that relationship of oppression and alienation with the West. And so this is a little sort of side issue in that much, much larger terrain. But obviously it kind of structures and it sets the tone for everything. Now, I'm always very impressed with those Muslims who try to step out of that dynamic, the dynamic of post-colonialism, and actually ask questions of truth. Because there are plenty of them, but I think they have a really hard time, because this issue of identity keep trumping those sorts of concerns. And of course the issues of identity don't always come labelled as issues of identity, they also come labelled as issues of truth. But in fact, if you look at the structure of the arguments, they're all to do with identity. So that, I mean, it's just a huge issue. I think it's one of the big problems in this domain, and indeed the relations between Christians and Muslims on the whole. You're absolutely right. I don't know enough about the Christian debate in the 19th century, but there wasn't that power imbalance between two different cultures, two different languages. It's just not there. And so even if there was an antagonistic relationship of sorts, it didn't have at all that sense of an imposition from outside. And that has two dimensions. One is the power dimension. The other is the cognitive dimension. I think it's really important we don't just hear it as an imbalance of power. This is also a foreign way of thinking. And it comes back to again, putting different sorts of metaphysics into conversation. How do you do that at a time when Islamic thought wasn't necessarily at its peak anyway? So those issues are really important. Thanks for bringing them up.
There's a question halfway down on my left, and then we'll come forward.
Yes, your presentation dealt with maybe a couple of 100 years. Just thinking that the history of Islam is 1,500 years,
yes.
And you've got that Islamizing the sciences screen up there now. There are two parts of history of Islam. One is a sort of Cordoba, Andalusia, where they seem to have been switched on to science and making progress, and the world now where they seem to have forgotten the simple process of asking and answering the question why. And I'm wondering if colonization is the main process that's created that big change, or are there other routes to that?
You touch on another sort of huge neuralgic issue, right? I mean, to put it very simply, there is a narrative that says you have this early flowering of the sciences and arts and all aspects of civilization under Islam for several centuries. You then get, thanks all to the work of Al-Ghazali, who, with the writing of one book, puts paid to the whole lot of Islamic philosophy and all the rest of it, suddenly brings all that to a juddering halt. You get a total closing down of the Islamic world and a sort of sclerosis of the tradition which we are living with today. That's a narrative, right? It's a narrative that's been used by some Muslims and heaps of Orientalists to try and make sense of a very bewildering and complicated history. Okay, so that's one explanation that people give, quite popular among sort of right-wing Catholic circles in the United States, for example, who want to argue that Islam is inherently sort of irrational, not inherently irrational, but it has been for the last few hundred years because of this sad inability to engage with philosophy. You see behind it the Catholic assumption that you've got to engage with philosophy or you sort of turn into fundamentalism. Well, that narrative has been subverted by all sorts of people, as you would probably expect it to be. We're in a university, that's what people do. So there is Islamic philosophy after Al-Ghazali. I mean, it is quite impossible to believe that one person could simply, through writing a very brilliant book, have brought a whole tradition to an end. And Islamic philosophy does continue. And that narrative of Islamic decline that says it all reaches a peak and then goes downhill has been contested by a great Protestant, Marshall Hodgson, who wrote one of those sort of great epic accounts of Islamic, in which he tells a story of tremendous flowering in that post-Al-Ghazali period, when you have three great Muslim empires dominating the Central Eurasian landmass. So that's all to do with the grand narratives that the Academy deals in. And it seems to me that there's all sorts of reasons to hesitate before endorsing that rather hackneyed story. Not to say there's absolutely no truth in it, but the idea that Islam, Sunni Islam in particular, has become totally unable to engage with these questions. And there are issues there, but it's a grand narrative which does more than it really should. Is that okay? Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question here. Can you wait for the microphone,
Yes,
please?
I'll wait. Okay. Thanks very much. In fact, my question was going to be on exactly the same thing. It just puzzles me as a physicist that early on in Islam they had a very open scientific way, and clearly something happened, and I didn't realise what it was that had happened. And I wonder if you could just expand slightly to enlighten me on this book that put a stop to everything, because that seems of fundamental importance, and I'm ignorant on that.
Okay. I mean, I was trying to undermine the narrative that you've just endorsed there, so...
I'm quite happy with that. It was just that one man could somehow write something which...
Well, it's incredible, isn't it? And that's because it just can't be true. I mean, it's a very brilliant book. I mean, Al-Ghazali started life as a bit of a rationalist, somebody who did rationalistic theology and philosophy, and then one day he came to give his lecture and had a bit of a breakdown. I just realised that he was just touting empty words. And he went off and had a conversion experience, embraced Sufism, and realised that in order to do to talk truly about God, you actually had to have the experience, the taste of God. Okay, this is the way the story is told, and this is true.
Surely you could say that all the observation that you do is revealing God's work.
Oh, right. Okay, that's another sort of Islamic identity. Yes, yes.
Oh, thank you.
So he went off, and I mean, to him is attributed the great sort of synthesis of Islamic theology, Islamic jurisprudence with Sufism, which sets the tone for certainly hundreds of years of an Islamic vision of what it is to be Muslim. But it's highly critical of speculative philosophy of the sort that people like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd produce. I mean, one of the people I mentioned, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, has written extensively on this. He's obviously got his own agenda, his own take. He blames Ibn Rushd for influencing Europe, because he says what happens, and this is correct, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, enters into the Latin tradition and fosters a new sort of rather arid rationalism, which eventually, Nasr says, kind of kills off the native sacred tradition of Catholic Christianity in this part of the world. So,
Thank you.
Okay.
Could you pass it just behind you, please?
It's a fascinating story you tell in your book and here about Bergsonian Islam. And what's striking about it, I think, is that there is a constructive integration going on between evolutionary thinking and Islam. And as you say, it's philosophical evolution rather than scientific evolution, but then that's not so different from Christianity. A lot of the early Christian engagement with evolution was with philosophical ideas about evolution rather than natural selection. But it seems to have completely died out in Islam, that sort of constructive engagement. And as far as I'm aware, the engagement is now solely at the level of whether Islam is compatible with evolution or not, or vice versa, rather, whether evolution is compatible with Islam. And I wonder why that constructive engagement has completely died out, Bergsonian or otherwise, and what are the prospects for getting it going again? I mean, is it, do you think, mainly an intellectual matter or a socio-political matter? I'd be very interested in your thoughts about that.
Yes, very interesting. I mean, Iqbal is honoured, everybody loves him and quotes his poetry, and nobody reads his book. I mean, as far as I can see, a few very quiet intellectuals in Pakistan I've spoken to, you know, who like to keep their work quiet, have read him and say he is the greatest genius of the 20th century in the Islamic world, and we need to listen to him and take him more seriously. Most Muslims that I would come across, certainly Pakistani Muslims, people of Pakistani heritage, venerate his memory. If you say to them, well, you know, he endorses a certain kind of evolutionary theory, they blanch and they say this cannot be possibly true. I mean, he wouldn't have done such a disgraceful thing. If you go to the Iqbal Foundation, the Iqbal Institute in Lahore, it's dominated now by perennialists, you know, his arch enemies. Sayyid Hossein Nasr says at one stage, Iqbal and I, we are Muslims, and that is all we have in common. I mean, he's quite clear that for him, Iqbal is the enemy inside the Muslim world. He just about acknowledged that he's a Muslim, but that is it. On the other hand, he's diametrically opposed to everything he stands for. And yet, people of Nasr's school are in charge now of the memory of Iqbal in Lahore, which is quite interesting, with a capital I. I mean, what is going on there? So your question is extremely apposite. Do I have an answer? Well, I suppose I've referred to a few of the things that I think are going on there. I mean, Iqbal is writing at a time of openness to the West in most domains. I mean, he's got his triumphalist edge to him, but he comes to Cambridge with a great desire to learn, and he discovers Bergson and writes about him. Corrects him, of course, in the light of certain Muslim sources. But there's a tremendous openness and a tremendous culture in what he writes, a real desire to engage with the West, for all that he's critical of elements of it. But that, you know, the climate shifts later in the 20th century for geopolitical reasons, for cultural reasons, for the rise of a different sort of Islamic thought. I mean, things do become rather more centred on Islamism later on. And there's a closing down of dialogue. It's to do with all sorts of things. Israel is a big one of them, one of the factors. Just that general dying out of a sort of liberal progressive Islam in favour of a more Islamist take. So complicated, but I think that is the picture.
I think we're pretty well out of time. Unfortunately, I see lots of late flowering of hands popping up, but hopefully some of you will be able to stay and join in the discussion, the conversation afterwards. So let's just thank Damian again for a very fascinating lecture.